Welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. Today we're making a pumpkin pie filled pumpkin shaped cake. So this cake is made with pumpkin spice cake layers and it's frosted with my American buttercream. I spread a thin layer of frosting on top of the cake layer and then I piped a dam around the perimeter of the cake layer. And this is really important because it's going to help keep our pumpkin pie filling in place. I added 2 generous scoops of our pumpkin pie filling and I then smoothed it out using a small offset spatula, keeping it within that frosting border. Once my filling was nice and level, I repeated this process with my remaining cake layers. The full recipe for this cake is up on Chelsweets.com, and I'll also include the link in the video description below. The pumpkin pie filling that we're using is so easy to make. It's really just some pureed pumpkin spice, a little bit of heavy cream, and some instant vanilla pudding mix. So it comes together super quickly and it is so delicious. It makes really the perfect cake filling because it's just thick enough to keep its shape, but it really adds a great moisture to the cake. Once the cake layers were all filled and stacked, I popped the cake into the freezer for about 10 minutes just to help it really stay in place. And I then began to carve away the bottom of the cake and the top to give it a slightly more sphered shape. And this is important because we are going to be turning this into a pumpkin, and by trimming away the cake layers, it's going to help us get that shape that we're after. While you might think that it would be easier to carve a cake if the layers weren't frozen, they actually lose a lot of their structure and are more difficult to get into a perfect shape. So even though it does make cutting through them a little bit harder, it really makes the whole process a lot smoother. So I highly recommend chilling the cake before you carve it. Once the cake was carved, I added a thin crumb coat all around the cake to trap in any loose crumbs, and I then smoothed it using a piece of acetate sheet. So I love using acetate sheets on sculpted cakes because they're really great for curved surfaces. Once I had chilled the cake again for about 5 minutes in the freezer, I added a second thicker layer of orange buttercream. And this is the same buttercream, just I added a little bit of orange gel food coloring. So I'm using the same process to smooth this by starting with my small offset spatula and working the frosting all the way around the cake up to the top. And once the cake was fully covered, I again used my acetate sheet just to really get around those curves and start to shape this cake. I started at the bottom and gently pulled up, and then I started to work my way around the cake as well just to get rid of any excess buttercream. And then came the really fun part. I have this massive frosting tip. I'll include the link to it in the video description below. But I began to pipe some vertical lines up the cake, which are going to be kind of the ridges that pumpkins have. So I made 2 lines of frosting for each little ridge, and I then began to smooth the edges of the frosting lines with my small offset spatula. So this took a lot of work to really get it into the proper shape, but by piping that frosting on, it really gives you a great base to start off of. So once I had done my best with my offset spatula, I began to work with my acetate sheet to really help this cake start to come together. So again, I'm doing the same sweeping motion of starting at the base and pulling up, and then I began to work on the sides as well. And this really took a lot of different passes, so be patient as you're doing this. And there's also another trick that helps get this really nice and smooth. So I popped the cake into the freezer for about 10 minutes to help the buttercream really firm up, and I then used a small kitchen torch to heat up my small offset spatula. I then used the heat on my spatula to help smooth out any of those rough lines and really help the buttercream kind of come together and become really smooth. One thing I will say is that by using heat, it's going to deepen the shade of your frosting. So just be sure that you're really covering every panel and using your heated spatula on all of it to make sure that your whole cake is the same color. Next, I went to work on the stump for the pumpkin. So I kept the tops of my cake layers that I had leveled, and I crumbed them up with a fork and then added some chocolate buttercream into the mix to create kind of like, I guess, cake pop batter. So once the cake layers had kind of turned into a dough with that chocolate frosting, I began to shape my stump. So I made it about 1.5 inches tall, and I added in some extra little bits to really make it look like the stump was growing, out of the pumpkin. Next, I melted some milk chocolate, and I coated the stump with this to help give it a little bit of texture, and also once the chocolate firms up, it'll really help keep the stump in place. So I really made sure to coat the entire thing, and I also made sure to leave some of those brush strokes in it to give it a really realistic look. After I made my cake, I decided I wanted to add some fall foliage around the base just to really hit home on the whole fall theme. So I twisted together some red, orange, and yellow fondant, and I then rolled this out using a small rolling pin. So the goal of this was to get somewhat of a marbled look to create some really beautiful leaves to place around the cake. To create these leaves, I'm using some different punch cutters that I got in a set on Amazon, and these punch cutters worked great. They cut out 3 different shaped leaves, and by pressing down on them, they create kind of some veins in the leaves that make them look really fun and pretty realistic, or about as realistic as this type of fondant leaves can get. So the last step was just to place these around the base of the cake, and then cut in to taste test that pumpkin pie filling. So of course I had to use a matching knife for this, and the only orange knife I had was one of my iridescent ones, so that was the one I used. So I decided to cut out an entire section of the pumpkin, which I think is actually a little bit smaller than my normal cake slices, but as you can see, the pumpkin pie filling is there, the cake layers are super moist, and I really recommend this recipe. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to let me know what tutorials you'd like to see next, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.